Level 1, the courier's son. The call comes at 3 in the morning. Your father's hand shakes you awake. He says nothing. He puts a leather satchel in your hands, 18 gold coins, 3 promissory notes, and pushes you toward the door. The courier who was supposed to make this delivery is bleeding in an alley 2 streets over. You're 14 years old. Northeast route. Count to 300 between each street lamp. If anyone stops you, you're delivering laundry. Your hands don't shake. What you feel instead is something cleaner than fear, a sudden absolute understanding that this moment will define everything after it. You live in Frankfurt's Judengasse, the street of the Jews, a walled ghetto where your family runs a coin dealership from a cramped office that smells of metal and tallow. Your father, Meyer Amschel Rothschild, assesses a Hessian thaler in 3 seconds, detecting a 0.2% silver reduction other dealers would miss entirely. He makes his margin in the gap between what money claims to be worth and what it actually is. You deliver the package. The recipient counts the contents, nods once, closes the door. No receipt, no confirmation. You walk home as the city wakes and you realize what your father has just taught you. Trust is a liability. Discretion is the only currency that never devalues. At 17, your father sends you to Hanover with a sealed letter. You're told explicitly not to read it. You read it anyway. The letter contains information about French troop movements, not a business proposal. Military intelligence. You deliver it unchanged. You say nothing, but you've crossed something. You now understand that your family's business was never about coins. It was always about knowing things before other people know them and converting that asymmetry into leverage. Level 2, the 5 arrows. You're 31. Your father is dying. He divides his empire with the precision of a general deploying battalions. Nathan to London, James to Paris, Salomon to Vienna, Karl to Naples. You, Amschel, hold Frankfurt. 5 sons, 5 capitals, 1 family. The strategy is elegant and ruthless. Operate as a single coordinated intelligence across 5 sovereign nations, moving information and capital across borders while everyone else still thinks in local markets. The fact that you're Jewish, barred from most traditional power structures, is not a vulnerability. It's a design feature. Nobody watches the people they've already excluded. You create financial instruments that don't have names yet, international bond markets, cross-border credit facilities, multi-currency arbitrage vehicles. You loan governments money they cannot raise from their own citizens. The interest is 6 to 8%, but the real value is never the interest. The real value is what finance ministers tell you in exchange for access. The moral compromise arrives slowly. You finance both sides of certain conflicts, not through error, but through architecture. Nathan loans Britain money to fight Napoleon. James maintains French relationships throughout. Your internal answer is precise. Wars happen independent of our involvement. We ensure the winning side, whichever it turns out to be, is indebted to us. 1815, Waterloo. Nathan's private courier network delivers the news before the British government's own intelligence. Nathan doesn't release it. He floods the market with British bond sales, triggering panic, prices collapse. Then, at the bottom, he buys everything. When official confirmation arrives the next day, British bonds recover completely. Nathan makes approximately £1 million in a single operation. You receive his coded message and sit with it for a long time. Your family can now generate wealth exceeding the GDP of small nations through pure information timing. You've crossed from being wealthy merchants into something else entirely. You stop thinking about money as something you earn. You start thinking of it as something you direct. Level 3, the courts they bought. Prime ministers no longer summon you. They request appointments. When Metternich needs to restructure Austrian debt, he comes to Salomon's Vienna office. You've achieved what no military conquest, no diplomatic treaty has ever produced. Stateless power. You are not subject to French law. You route through London, not constrained by British regulation. You restructure through Naples. You exist in the gaps between national sovereignties. Governments control their territory. You control the space between territories. That space is invisible, unlegislated, and infinite. A revolution breaks out in France in 1830. James is in Paris, directly in the path of mob violence that has historically targeted Jewish financiers. He doesn't evacuate. He offers the revolutionary government immediate credit to stabilize the transition. Within 72 hours, he's negotiating loan terms with men who were burning aristocratic properties 3 days earlier. His coded message arrives: governments change, debt survives. You understand what it means. Nations can overthrow monarchies, replace every person in every position of authority, but they cannot function without access to international credit. And international credit flows through you. You're no longer participating in the system. You are the system. Level 4, the bones of nations. You're staring at maps of Europe, and you're not looking at political boundaries. You're looking at proposed railroad routes. Railroads don't just move goods. They determine which cities dominate for the next century, which national economies develop circulatory systems capable of sustaining industrial competition. Infrastructure outlasts governments. You've been financing the politics of the present. Now you're going to finance the physics of the future. You take 12 to 20% stakes in dozens of railroad companies across 6 countries, enough influence to coordinate route decisions, not enough exposure to absorb blame when projects fail. The Vienna-Prague line, the Paris-Nord Railway, the Lion-Mediterranean Corridor. You're not asking what's profitable, you're asking what becomes inevitable, and positioning ahead of it. The moral compromise becomes invisible, not because you stop seeing it, but because the distance between your decisions and their consequences extends far enough that causation becomes philosophical. The railroad routes you make viable require displacing thousands of families. Rural economies collapse when lines bypass them. You didn't order these displacements directly. You made certain routes fundable and left others starved of capital. The outcome is identical to a direct order. The paper trail leads nowhere near you. A British consortium approaches about railroad financing in colonial India. Projected returns 18 to 22%, secured against Indian tax revenues guaranteed by the Raj. You know about the Bengal famines. You understand that these railroads will be used to move food away from starving regions toward ports where it commands higher international prices. You approve the financing. You tell yourself it's a straightforward investment decision. You tell yourself that if you decline, someone else approves it within the week. Both things are true. Neither is a justification. You know the difference. You approve it anyway. Level 5, the shadow sovereign. A European monarch wants a meeting. You decline. 3 days later, his prime minister arrives with a revised proposal. You take the meeting on your schedule in your building. Kings operate on your schedule now. That isn't arrogance. It's arithmetic. You host private dinners. Carefully assembled, the Austrian finance minister, a British railway magnate, a French industrial innovator, a Prussian military procurement officer. These individuals represent competing national interests. They would never appear in the same room through official channels. Around your table, they become collaborative because you've structured investments that align their financial interests in ways their governments haven't sanctioned and wouldn't approve. You're not just influencing policy, you're building parallel governance structures that operate below the visibility threshold of democratic accountability. The Crimean War begins. Both Britain and Russia need financing simultaneously. British bonds through the London office under the family name, Russian bonds through a Vienna shell entity, voting shares controlled through a trust structure 3 layers removed from any visible Rothschild connection. When journalists ask if you're financing both sides, you say, the Rothschild Bank of London has no direct involvement with Russian financing. This is technically true. It is functionally false. The war runs 3 years. Approximately 750,000 die. Your family's combined position increases by an estimated 40%. You attend a memorial service for a young Austrian officer from a family you've known socially. You feel genuine grief. Then you return to your office and review the quarterly reports. The numbers are excellent. Both feelings are real. They exist in separate compartments that have never communicated. You've stopped expecting them to. You are a decent man who operates mechanisms that produce atrocities. You've made peace with that paradox by engineering the cognitive separation required to hold both halves without ever examining them together. Level 6, the ghost who moves markets. Disraeli sends a private message on a Tuesday afternoon. Parliament is not in session. The British government needs £4 million to acquire the Egyptian government's stake in the Suez Canal. It needs it by Friday. There is no authorized mechanism for this. He is asking whether you can move faster than constitutional process. You consult no board. You call no meeting. You say yes. £4 million, approximately £500 million in present value, committed in 72 hours, secured by nothing except the word of a prime minister and your own assessment of his reliability. Britain secures the Suez Canal. You've just demonstrated something no treaty, no military victory has achieved. A private family can move faster than a sovereign government when history is moving quickly. Your strategy now operates across 3 timescales simultaneously. Short-term, currency arbitrage exploiting a 6-hour information advantage generated by your private telegraph network, the first privately operated transnational communication infrastructure in history. Medium term, positioning in steel, industrial chemicals, petroleum before governments understand these sectors will define the next century. Long term, structural equity in the emerging central banks of 4 continents. You don't own companies. You own the debt of the companies that own the companies. Equity holders get blamed when things fail. Creditors get paid regardless. Level 7, the architecture of disappearance. Your grandson asks you what you do. You think about it seriously for the first time in years. You tell him, "We help countries with their finances." It's the most accurate thing you've said in 30 years, and it tells him nothing. You've spent the last decade restructuring your family's public profile. The actual decision-making architecture is distributed across holding companies, charitable foundations, family trusts, and minority investment vehicles so complex that even your senior legal team cannot map the complete structure without weeks of preparation. The deepest rule at this level: never accumulate power that requires active defense. Influence that must be protected is already declining. Real power is structural. It generates itself, sustains itself, and survives changes in personnel and ideology without maintenance. Then a political movement rises in Germany, nationalist, anti-Semitic, your family named explicitly. For the first time since childhood, you feel something you'd almost forgotten: vulnerability, your standard toolkit, financial pressure, media relationships, political connections. You analyze it and recognize something unprecedented. This movement feeds on the visibility you'd create by opposing it directly. It wants a target. Your instruments of influence become the story. You begin quietly, systematically repositioning assets. Britain, America, Switzerland, Argentina. It takes 7 years of careful movement. By the time the threat fully materializes, your core capital is distributed across jurisdictions that will remain stable regardless of what happens in Central Europe. The lesson costs more than any financial crisis, but it confirms the deepest truth. Systems are not permanent. The structures you build to control the world can be turned against you by forces that don't operate within the system's logic. History doesn't negotiate. Terminal condition: you are not a person anymore, not in the sense that matters. There is a body, a name, a face that appears at charitable galas and financial conferences. This figure is real. He experiences things genuinely, has relationships and a family he loves. But you, the actual decision-making intelligence that carries 4 centuries of operational knowledge, exists somewhere else entirely, in the pattern of positions spanning 7 decades, in relationships maintained across generations with institutions that have outlasted every government they were built to serve. Your name circulates in conspiracy theories across 4 continents. The theories are simultaneously grotesquely exaggerated and structurally accurate. You don't control governments, but you influence the financial conditions within which governments operate. At sufficient remove, the distinction collapses. You're reviewing succession documents, not the legal ones, but the operational ones, the encoded knowledge, the relationship architectures, 4 centuries of learning how power actually moves beneath the visible surface of events. You're trying to distill it into something transmissible, and you discover that you cannot. The knowledge doesn't exist in propositions or frameworks. It exists in a way of seeing, accumulated over a lifetime of watching the gap between how power presents itself and how it actually moves. You can transmit information. You cannot transmit the lens. You close the documents. You look through the window at London and think of your great-great-great-grandfather standing in the Judengasse before dawn, holding a leather satchel, counting the seconds between street lamps. He didn't know what he was beginning. He just moved forward. Somewhere in Frankfurt, a 23-year-old is starting his first position at a mid-tier investment bank. He believes he's beginning a career. He doesn't know he's entering a structure that is 4 centuries old. The door has already closed behind him, and somewhere, someone is counting